morning, everybody. Whew, with a response that resounding, you just know that it's going to be a good class. I'll give a second shot. Good morning, everybody. Sweet. All right. We are in Nehemiah chapter 5, if you want to be opening up there. As we are getting settled in, getting going, getting open to Nehemiah 5, I just want to tell all of you guys that I'm really appreciating all the comments and the engagement in the class. I think it's been a really good study so far, in large part due to everybody chiming in and contributing. So I just want to encourage you to keep doing that and keep that going, because that just makes the discussion a lot richer than just hearing what I have to say. Let's go ahead and open up with a word of prayer, and I can lead that for us, and then we'll get into our material this morning. Dear Father in heaven, thank you that we get the opportunity to study your word. Thank you that you've revealed yourself to us and that you have loved us with such a great love and made us your people. Help us as we look into the days of Nehemiah to see the lessons that you would want us to see, to grow nearer to you, and to be shaped and fashioned more in your likeness and in your Son's likeness. In him we pray. Amen. All right. So last time in chapter 4, we talked about dealing with discouragement. And we talked about things like when discouragement happens and how it happens and why it happens, and just kind of walked through lessons that we can take from that right after or maybe during great successes, we often find ourselves set up for discouragement and disappointment to follow close behind. And so we looked at how the people persevered through that last bullet on our slide, how they turned to the Lord, they used faith in action, and they served each other and worked together to get through discouragement. What we're going to see this morning in chapter 5, and I hope you've had a chance to read it, but we've got a different issue now facing the people. So think about how far we've come, right? Think about just the difficulty getting the Persian king to sign off on this operation. And then we get to the land, and there's discouragement and opposition of people who don't want the Jews to rebuild, and they start persevering through that. And now we have a different problem about money issues and status issues and the rich and the poor clashing, and it's more of an internal struggle. And so I want you to be thinking about those things as we get ready to read the text of how would that be different to the challenges that we've seen so far. What are the issues that come when we talk about money issues or we talk about infighting among the family? And our goals for class, we're going to step back and understand the context of lending and money in the Old Testament, because we're jumping into Nehemiah 5, and Nehemiah is extremely upset by what he sees, and he says, none of this is right, but we might need a little refresher on, well, what's so wrong about what's going on here? We're going to look at how they dealt with the problem. If we have time, that third bullet point, we're going to look at Nehemiah's expense reports and see what we can learn from that. And I see everybody's face lighting up at that bullet point. It's probably just me, but I woke up this morning and I thought, biblical expense reports, all right, that's right in my wheelhouse. But there's actually some really good stuff from the end of the chapter about how Nehemiah spends the funds that he was given. And the last point is the most important one, that we go through this chapter as I want to do with all the chapters. We're not just trying to understand the ancient story and what happened, but also what it means. And so there's going to be principles about stewardship, about fairness, about generosity, about how we handle our money and how we get along. That is really where I want to push the discussion this morning. So let's get Michael, if you wouldn't mind to read for us. Let's get into our text. Would you read verses 1 through 5 of Nehemiah 5?
Now there arose a great outcry of the people and their wives against the Jewish brothers. For there were those who said, our sons and daughters, we are so many. So let us get grain and let us eat and keep alive. There were also those who said, we are mortgaging our fields and our vineyards, our houses to get grain because of the famine. And there were those that said, we have borrowed money for the king's taxes on our fields and our vineyards. Now our flesh is as the flesh of our brothers, Our children are as their children, yet we are forcing our sons and our daughters to be slaves. And some of our daughters have already been enslaved, but it is not our power to help it. For other men have our fields and our vineyards.
Perfect. Okay. So, what do you see here? You can refer back to those 5 verses. What are the problems that are brought before Nehemiah here? Yeah, good. So one of them is that they're having to mortgage their fields and their vineyards and all of that just to try to keep up financially. There's a couple more. There's 3 complaints that are brought before Nehemiah.
They can't afford to live with the taxes.
Yeah, the taxes are really high and we can't keep up with the taxes. Good. And then one more in verse 2, probably the most sort of basic one is we've got a big family and we don't even have enough food to put on the table. So I laid out those 3 little blurbs of things that people say to Nehemiah, and we're trying to take kind of a first-person perspective. So I want you to put yourself in the shoes of the leader of the people. You're trying to progress on this project, and then you hear things like this. I've got a big family, and I can't even feed them right now. How do you want me to continue on with this project? We don't have enough to eat. And then, like Jessica said, we're mortgaging our fields and our vineyards and our houses to get grain because of the famine. That's that image that I threw up there of like barren land. There's nothing is being produced at all. And then maybe the most depressing one is that last point of we've borrowed money and now we've got no other option and we're sending our own sons and daughters to be slaves to try to pay off our debts. Look in these 5 verses and I want you to see what can you tell, and we've mentioned a couple of them, but what are the causes of this situation? Like how did we end up in a spot so dire?
There seems to be some external kind of this famine situation. It's kind of like that might have been kind of the start
Yeah.
of some of these things and kind of outside of their own control.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. So I think the famine seems like it's the biggest impetus of the thing that just the straw that broke the camel's back. So they probably had high taxes before. We know that they were poor before, and these are kind of the remnant of people who either stayed in the land or made it back to the land, and they don't really have anything. The city's in ruins, and so they're already dealing with all of those things. And then we see this famine, and now they can't keep up. And we also, what we're going to see as we move forward in the text is that some of the Jews were charging interest to their fellow Jews, and I think it's fair to think of these guys as kind of loan sharks or opportunists who are seeing people who are really poor, who don't have any other options, and are saying, yeah, I'll give you money to pay the king's tax, but it's going to cost you. And I don't know if there was any kneecap breaking, but you see like the straits that these people get themselves into. And clearly, not only is there a famine, not only is there high taxes, but there are people who are kind of taking advantage of the situation. All right, so I said we were going to go back and sort of understand the Old Testament rules about lending so that we get the full picture of what's going on. And little did you know, we get a pop quiz. So here's how this is going to work. I'll just read the question first, and then I want a show of hands for what you think. And I had to look up all of this stuff, so don't worry, because we're not always as familiar with the Mosaic practices. But according to the law of Moses, which of the following things were prohibited? So there may be more than one right answer. Lending money as a whole was prohibited, lending money at interest to a foreigner, lending money at interest to a Jew, taking a Jew into slavery for debts. All right, now you get to vote, and if anybody gets it right, there's a gold star for you. So who thinks lending money as a whole was prohibited in the law? Show of hands. All right. Lending money at interest to a foreigner. Wow, everybody's holding fast. At least one of these was wrong. C, lending money at interest to a Jew. Okay, good number of hands. And D, taking a Jew into slavery for their debts. A few hands. A lot of non-conviction. That's probably where I would be. I'd be like maybe casting a vote for a few of these. Okay, it's C and D. They were allowed to lend money, and they were allowed to charge interest to a foreigner, but the Jews in the law of Moses were not allowed to lend money at interest to their fellow Jews, and they definitely weren't allowed to take fellow Jews into slavery. And we're seeing both of those problems happen in our text. Let's go back and understand a little bit more of what we see here. The first principle, and we can go back to Exodus 22, is you're not supposed to charge interest to your Jewish brother. Exodus 22, starting in verse 21. Dave, would you mind reading this passage for us? Exodus 22, 21 through 27.
You shall not wrong a sojourner or oppress him, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. You shall not mistreat any widow or fatherless child. If you do mistreat them, and they cry out to me, I will surely hear their cry. And my wrath will burn, and I will kill you with the sword. And your wives shall become widows, and your children fatherless. If you lend money to any of my people with you who is poor, you shall not be like a moneylender to him, and you shall not exact interest from him. If ever you take your neighbor's cloak and pledge, you shall return to him before the sun goes down. That is his only covering, and it is his cloak for his body. And what else shall he sleep? And if he cries to me, I will hear, for I am compassionate.
Okay, thanks, Dave. So what did you notice in that passage? What stood out to you?
Well, one is he identifies to his audience, which is the Jewish people. He identifies them as my people.
Mm-hmm.
He's taking possession of them and saying, if you're doing this to my people, then I'm going to do this.
Yeah, good. So there's that very good sense in which we get to think of ourselves or the Israelites in this day as God's family, but it's also God saying, you better not cross my family and mistreat my family. Kevin?
He also calls out some of the most vulnerable individuals, the widow, the fatherless child, the people that most probably need help in these types of situations.
Yeah, good. So originally I just had verse 25, and then I started looking at the verses around it, and I think that gives us a better sense of what God's trying to get at. And he's saying, don't take advantage of the orphan. Don't take advantage of the widow. If somebody tells you they're going to pay you back and gives you their coat, get it back to them by night. Don't make them suffer. Don't hold out on them. Michael?
I think it's also interesting, so in Exodus 20 is when they get given the Ten Commandments. And then right after that, we get past the law of Moses, but then God goes in and tells the people how to be decent people towards their brothers and sisters. So, don't be taking advantage of them. Help those who have problems. If they're poor, give them the money so that they can make ends meet and let them pay you back whenever.
Mm-hmm.
Just be good people.
Yeah, perfect. I'm glad you draw that out. So we're only 2 chapters past the 10 Commandments. So think about just the way that the law is being given. We start with the 10 Commandments and we say these are the most important things. We are just past that. In my Bible, we're 1 page past that. So these are, I think, fair to say, top of mind things for God. And he says, I am a compassionate God. And if you're going to follow me, you need to be compassionate too and not taking advantage of people even if they're in a hard situation and they can't repay. And let's go over to Deuteronomy 23 as well. I think that's one of the things that we can see as we look at the law a little closer. It's not just arbitrary rules. It's things that are part of God's character that he's wanting to impart to the people. So I'm compassionate, you be compassionate. I'm going to look out for the little ones among you. You do the same. Kevin, would you read these couple verses, Deuteronomy 23, 19 and 20? Oh, sorry, I was Kevin Wise, but Kevin Ingle, you be my next reader.
You shall not charge interest on loans to your brother, interest on money, interest on food, interest on anything that is lent for interest. You may charge a foreigner interest, but you may not charge your brother interest, that the Lord your God may bless you in all that you undertake in the land that you are entering to take possession of it.
Great. So this is where we see you can charge a foreigner interest. If you're doing business with somebody out there, you can go by the normal customs. That's fine. And I think that's good for us to see. The point that I'm trying to leave you with is not that God is opposed to us profiting or doing business or making money. I think we understand that's all fine. But he says, when it's with your brother, don't charge him interest. You're a family. And so if your brother's in need and you lend him something, don't get out the rate table and figure out how much you can squeeze out of him and turn a profit. That's not what this is about. We're a family, and you need to treat each other as a family. And if you're going to help your brother, then help your brother. Don't have something in it for yourself. If you'll allow me to tell a little story, a story came to mind here that gets told in the whole house, and that was used to educate me. And it goes like this. My mom and dad were like married for just a few years, and they were updating some of their furniture, and so they had this old piece of furniture, maybe it was a table that they didn't need anymore. And so my dad's mom was over, and I guess they brought it up, and she said, oh, I still like that table. And my dad said, like, oh, great, like, you can have it for like $50. Thinking that he was being nice by giving it at a price a lot lower than he would have sold it to anybody else. And apparently my mom kind of found a moment, pulled him off to the side and said, like, you don't sell things to your mother, like, she's your mother. She brought you into the world. Like, I know you think you're being nice by doing it at a discount. You give things to your mother. If your mother, after all she's done, wants something, like, she gets to have the table, Don't take your $40 and think that that's a great exchange. Like, we're a family. If somebody wants something, we give it. And I think you can see the connection, right? That's what God is saying. We're a family. And our first goal is not to make money off each other. It's not to profit in some way. It's to help each other out. And that's Old Testament, and I think we'll see that's New Testament too. If somebody needs something, give it. If you're going to lend it, fine. But as Michael said, don't be stingy with the terms of repayment. And that brings us to our second principle, which I think you can already see now that we're understanding how God's thinking about money and helping each other. You're not going to take someone into slavery over unpaid debts. Leviticus 25 is our last passage from the law that I want us to see. Leviticus 25. Kevin Engel, thanks for being at the ready here. I'll have you read Leviticus 25, 35 through 40, please.
Take no interest from him or profit, but fear your God, that your brother may live beside you. You shall not lend him your money or at interest, nor give him your food for profit. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt and gave you the land of Canaan, and to be your God. If your brother becomes poor beside you and sells himself to you, you shall not make him serve as a slave. He shall be with you as a hired worker and as a sojourner. He shall serve with you until the year of Jubilee.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, so some of that sounds familiar. You're not going to charge interest. Don't take advantage of your brother in that way. But God says someone may have a big debt and they may choose to work that debt off if they're unable to repay. And he says that's fine, but you're not going to treat them as a slave. You're going to treat them just like you would treat someone you hired out, and you're going to take care of them. And there's these specified dates of release. So he talks about the Jubilee year. Every 50 years, everything is wiped clean. All slaves are set free. The land goes back to its original owners. One of the things I read, I thought put it well. It said, like, you really couldn't sell your land according to the Mosaic law. You could basically lease it because there's always going to be a time where it all ended and it all reset. And God's saying, no matter what kind of hole you get yourself into, I'm going to give a reset. I'm going to give a way back. Every 7 years, there was a Sabbath year that was supposed to be a smaller forgiveness of debts. And then the 50th year, it was just all wiped clean. And so from that, I boiled down two overarching principles that we can see on how God was thinking about money, and I think still is thinking about it. The first one is to treat each other as family. That's the story of selling the table to mom. And the second one is that everything ultimately belongs to God. He'll say that in this Leviticus 25 chapter. It's all mine. And so don't get too attached. Don't get too focused on turning a profit. Don't take advantage of someone in their hard times. It belongs to me. Let's go back to Nehemiah 5 now. And I think with all of that, you can understand just a little bit more, hopefully, why what we're seeing was so egregious. In Nehemiah 5, remember the first 5 verses that we read? We had some people who have an abundance and they're rich and they're fat and happy that we'll see a little bit later in the chapter, and some people can't eat. That's not the spirit of the law. We have some who are being forced to mortgage their land and sell everything just to keep up, and we're going to see that that was a result of interest being charged that just kept snowballing. And then we've got Jews having to sell themselves to other Jews, and a rich and wealthy Jewish class who's allowing that and taking sons and daughters into slavery. And so you get now, chapter 5 and verse 6, Nehemiah says, I was very angry when I heard their outcry in these words. And so what we're going to do now is look at verses 6 through 13 and see what the response was to this situation. Adam, would you mind to read chapter 5, 6 through 13?
I was very angry when I heard their outcry and these words. I took counsel with myself, and I brought charges against the nobles and the officials. I said to them, you are exacting interest, each from his brother. And I held a great assembly against them, and said to them, we, as far as we are able, have bought back our Jewish brothers who have been sold to the nations. But you even sell your brothers that they may be sold to us. They were silent and could not find a word to say. So I said, the thing that you are doing is not good. Ought you not to walk in the fear of our God to prevent the taunts of the nations, our enemies? Moreover, I and my brothers and my servants are lending them money and grant. Let us abandon this exacting of interest. Return to them this very day their fields, their vineyards, their olive orchards, and their houses, and the percentage of money, grain, wine, and oil that you have been exacting from them. Then they said, we will restore these and require nothing from them. We will do as you say. And I called the priests and made them swear to do as they had promised. I also shook out the fold of my garment and said, so may God shake out every man from his house and from his labor who does not keep this promise. So may he be shaken out and empty. And all the assembly said, amen. And praise the Lord. And the people did as they had promised.
All right, thank you. So I want to give you all the first crack on this passage. There we go. What steps are taken to resolve the issue, and what stands out to you about the way the situation was handled? So feel free to take a second, look over what we just read, and tell me what you noticed about how they solved this problem. Yeah, they faced it. That one kind of actually stood out to me because Nehemiah is a very focused guy. He's building this wall. The wall's halfway built. We find out it only takes 52 days to build the wall. So couldn't you see him saying, like, guys, we only have a few more weeks of building this. Like, I'm sorry that things aren't going well for you financially, but we need to stay focused on this. I don't really have time for this sidebar. Like, just deal with it, figure it out. I've got to press on to my work. I think I would be tempted to move in that direction, to just say, that sounds like a personal problem, you know, I'm sorry, maybe you should have thought of that, you shouldn't have gone to that lender, or whatever the case is, and maybe been light on compassion, or just heads down, focused on the work that I'm doing. But when Nehemiah hears of a problem and hears of people being mistreated, he stops what he's doing. We don't see any record in this chapter until the very end of the wall. Like, that just gets put off to the side, and we're going to fix what we need to fix. We're going to make sure that we're doing the right things. We're taking care of our fellow Jews, and then we'll get back to everything else, which I think is impressive. What else, Kevin?
I like right at the very beginning, in verse 6, where he says he was very angry, and then the next verse is, I took counsel with myself. And so, like, he took that moment to step aside and cool off and think about it reasonably. And I can't help but think that after reading especially the verse from Exodus, that Nehemiah is coming from, he's been in captivity, he's been in this other land, and in the law, some of what we just read was, when God hears his people make the outcry, like the people that just came to Nehemiah, he says God is going to hear them and set things right. And so, it very well, I can see Nehemiah being in this position, like, I just made it back from the foreign land that we were taken into captivity for, stuff like this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great point, and that gets to both Ezra and Nehemiah see themselves and play the role of a restorer, and they're restoring not only things like the temple and the wall, but the Jewish practices and the faithfulness and the righteousness. And so Nehemiah says, we're not going back to this. He even, I think it's verse 8, he says, we've been trying to buy our Jews back from slavery from foreign nations. How dare you undo that and put each other in slavery? Like, we're building the road back to God. We're restoring. We're moving in the right direction. And this is something that we're going to have to rip out at the roots. What else? Luke?
Yeah, you started touching on this, but like he's not solely focused on the physical. So we rebuild the city. We have a wall around our city, and then what do we fill it with? Do we fill it with the same filth that is on the outside?
Yeah.
Or do we cleanse ourselves and then we're building a wall around our city and we're filling it with not filth,
Good.
but righteousness and justice?
Yeah, I love that. So we talked about the wall being, it's not just a wall. It's a way to say God's people are within and everybody else is without. And so there's a purifying process that's supposed to happen within that we're distinct, which I think we see in verse 9. One of the reasons Nehemiah says to cut this out is the thing that you're doing is not good. Ought you not to walk in the fear of God to prevent the taunts of the nations of our enemies? So what he says is, you're acting like everybody out there. And we're trying to build this wall and say, we're different, we're God's people, and we're going to get back to that. And then you enslave each other over a buck? They're laughing at you and they're saying, this isn't a holy nation. These people don't have higher priorities. They don't have brotherly love for each other. They're just like everybody else. And it's an interesting and important note that our actions reflect more broadly than just ourselves, especially things that we do as a group. That's a reflection on God. And what we try to claim and who we are gives us a high standard to live up to, that we have to be careful that we're following through on that. Jonathan.
I was just thinking about how, there's an obvious winner and loser in this situation. For the enslaved people, this was obviously good. For the people who had slaves, this was not good.
Mm-hmm.
They just lost a ton of people. So, getting back to standard, I guess you might say, or getting back to God's way, sometimes it's going to be a big reset in our own lives. If you get in the practice of doing something wrong, and then you got to break that practice, it's not going to be fun necessarily, but it's what's necessary.
Yeah, good thought. There's a counting the cost aspect, and what ends up happening is that the lenders have to give everything back, not just the interest that they shouldn't have collected. They give it all back. They give all the stuff, all the fields, all the vineyards, and they lost a lot in this in order to get things back to square one, back to how they should be. Good thought. Others? All right, I'll go through my list here. I think we got most of these. Nehemiah listens, cares, and helps. So he just cares enough that when somebody comes and says something is wrong, he stops what he's doing and he's moved to action. Kevin talked about this one. His righteous anger is useful and kept under control. So wouldn't you say in this text, he uses the anger, right? He doesn't just put the anger totally off to the side and say a leader of God's people isn't supposed to be angry. But what he makes sure that he does is that he channels the anger. Verse 7 says, I took counsel with myself. I thought through this. Knowing Nehemiah, it's a safe assumption that he prayed about it, made sure that he was going to approach it in the right way. And then he goes about his work, still with focus and intensity and passion, but not out of control. Not just as soon as he hears it, I can't believe you did this, and just rails. There's very systematic approach that I call the great assembly, I press charges, I lay everything out. The people end up, there's nothing they can say back to it because it's all been done in such an airtight way and it actually gets resolved. And that's the third thing. Sin is dealt with in public before the great assembly. So he calls everybody and he said, this thing, maybe people were trying to do it off to the side. I'm sure that they weren't necessarily proud of it, though they were benefiting from taking their brothers into slavery. And he said, let's have some accountability. We're a family. Let's have a big family meeting and say, we're not doing this anymore. He lays out the accusations. Look at verse 10. Verse 10 I had to read a few times. This is Nehemiah, first person. Moreover, I and my brothers and my servants are lending them money and grain. Let us abandon this exacting of interest. And then he goes on and tells the people to return stuff. So I like Nehemiah. I think he's got a lot of admirable things. But remember our point. Who's the hero in the book of Nehemiah? Oh, that's an open-ended. Who's the hero? God, yeah. Probably posed it rhetorically, but I wanted an answer. God is the hero. Nehemiah is a good guy, but he's not perfect. And he says that we've been lending himself and his peers. I think from the way he reacted and from the fact that it says later he didn't own any land, I don't think that he was taking slaves. I don't even think that he was charging interest. I think he was probably doing the thing that was okay and just lending and saying, here you go, pay me back when you can. But whatever the case is, he takes responsibility and he says, I know, like, I've been lending too. Maybe lending in an okay way, but if I'm asking you to repay it and cancel it all, I'm going to do the same thing. And he's forthright about that. He doesn't act like he is perfect or on a pedestal. The remedy involves full restitution. We talked about that in verse 11, that it's not just give back the interest you shouldn't have collected. Let's just go ahead and do a mini jubilee, and let's just wipe it all clean. Let's reset. It's a famine. Everybody's struggling. We're just going to give things back. We're going to release everybody and make sure that we get back to the proper state. And then in verse 13, when justice is served, the Lord is glorified. So this isn't just a civil issue or a interpersonal issue. It's a spiritual issue. Look at verse 13. I shook out the fold of my garment and said, so may God shake out every man from his house and from his labor who does not keep this promise. So may he be shaken out and emptied. And all the assembly said amen and praised the Lord. And the people did as they had promised. So once we've dealt with this, now we can praise the Lord. Now we can be back to being God's people. And note that we got to make sure that there's actually follow through on it. Not a lot of good things to say about the lenders in this situation, but one thing I'll give them credit for, when the charges were in front of them, they didn't say anything. They knew that they were in the wrong, and then they promised that, hey, we're going to fix this, and they did it. And there's at least something to be said for that, right? These people had messed up in a really public way. They had sinned and kind of had a spiral of sins and were taking advantage of others, but at least they're willing to fix it and correct it. And then they all go out and praise the Lord. And this is what it's supposed to look like. This is God's family. We're getting back. We're restoring. We're moving in the right direction. We're helping each other instead of taking advantage of each other. Let's zoom out just a little bit. We've kind of got the whole story now. I want you to just start thinking, what are the principles here? What can we learn and apply and take away from something like this? Maybe we've touched on one or two, but I want you to think, like, what does this chapter bring about in our own life? How would it shape the way that we handle our money or handle our relationships with other people? What do you think? I'll give you one while the wheels are turning, and that's just that how we handle our money is a spiritual matter. And it's tempting to want to kind of set that off to the side, and my business dealings or my financial dealings, that's one thing, and my Christian life is another thing. But clearly, the way that we interact and the way that we use our funds and the way that we treat others all comes together as a Christian, and everything that we do is something that matters to God and that He cares about. What else? What does this make you think of, Kevin?
I think this was probably something that was very normal for where they were, as they were over in Persia and things like that. It was just those things had influenced them, and it became the norm for them. So I think that's, as we live our lives spiritually, we need to guard against some of those external influences that can kind of help cause our minds to kind of shift to what is normal or acceptable.
Yeah, that's really good. Because we even laid out, they were allowed to charge interest to a foreigner, and they were just kind of coming back and reestablishing themselves. And so just remembering this is different, and there's a different standard for me, and I need to behave differently. Very good. What else? Jonathan?
Well, some of this principle is repeated in Luke chapter 6, verse 32 onward. If you love those who love you, what benefit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who do good to you, what benefit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. And if you lend to those from whom you expect to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners to get back the same amount. But love your enemies and do good and lend, expecting nothing in return, and your reward will be great. And you will be the sons of the Most High, for he is kind to the ungrateful and evil. Be merciful, even as your Father is merciful.
Perfect. So, taking your comment and Kevin's comment together, I think when we get to money issues and handling money and how we treat money and how we treat each other, I feel like it's one of the topics where we have to most break the societal view, and we have to really move in a different direction. And maybe it's even like more for me working in business. I went to business school for a couple of years, and you know what they don't tell you in business school is just lend and don't worry that much about if they can repay, and don't charge interest, and like we're just a family and help each other. There are not many successful companies that were built with that ethos. But in the Christian sphere, I was thinking of a place, and we won't turn there for time, but like Acts chapter 4, it's our job to help each other as a family. And I like the passage you brought up, Jonathan. In Acts 4, the disciple or the followers come and sell property, and they sell land, and they lay it at the apostles' feet, and they say, we heard people need help, and so I went out and sold the field, and here's money, and just use it however you see fit to help each other. And that's something that is uncomfortable for us, that's hard, that involves a sacrifice, but that's the way that we ought to be thinking about our money. And I think as we look at this chapter, is there a time and a place that we might want to actually do business with each other? Sure. And I think that's okay. You wouldn't find anybody to dispute that. But our first and our pressing priority has got to be, we're a family, can I help you? Can I do something for you? Can I give you something? If we both decide we're going to do business, okay, that's fine. But our goal and our number one thing that we do is we help each other, we support each other, we're generous. I thought about James 2 as well, where he says, if you see your brother in need and you say, be warm and filled, what good is that? We're supposed to actually be driven to helping each other and making sure that we have everything we need. I think we got everything there. So let's do our last part, Nehemiah's expense reports. Chapter 5, 14 through 19. Luke, would you read that text for us?
Moreover, from the day that I was appointed to be their governor in the land of Judah, from the 20th year to the 32nd year of King Artaxerxes, for 12 years neither I nor my kinsmen have eaten the governor's food allowance. But the former governors who were before me laid burdens on the people and took from the bread and the wine, besides 40 shekels of silver. Even their servants domineered the people, but I did not do so because of the fear of the Lord. I also applied myself to the work on this wall. We did not buy any land, and all my servants were gathered there for the work. Moreover, there were at my table 150 Jews and officials, besides those who came to us from the nations that were around us. Now that which was prepared for each day was 1 ox and 6 choice sheep, and also birds were prepared for me. And once in 10 days all sorts of wine were furnished in abundance. Yet for all this I did not demand the governor's food allowance, because the servitude was heavy on this people. Remember me, O my God, for good, according to all that I have done for this people.
Thank you. Okay, so the question behind me is the one I want us to think about for a second. How does this fit with the rest of the chapter, and what do you think the point is? take a stab, Ryan.
I mean, the whole concept is that everyone had the wrong idea about how to use their money. And then, they got their head right, and then there was this major restitution that was, good for some and a sacrifice for others. And then at the end, Nehemiah is saying, and the whole time, this is what I've been doing, and, just, this is for you, God, because, that's what I should be doing. And I think that just keeps helps keep our head right about the attitude we need to have towards money. It's just another tool for good.
Yeah, perfect. I think that's exactly right. So I think there's a deliberate contrast between here's how the lenders were doing it, and they were kind of trapping people in a cycle of ever-increasing interest that they couldn't get out of and forcing people into slavery. And Nehemiah said, basically, if I can summarize, I had the right to tax the people as the governor, and I just waived it because there was a heavy burden on them already. I knew that they were struggling, and I said, let's figure out another way. In verse 15, he talks about the former governors who were before me laid heavy burdens on the people. So he definitely could have taxed them. And from the reading that I did, the normal thing to do would be to send out a tax collector, and he would take a huge bill, and he'd give a little to Nehemiah, and he'd give a little to the guys below Nehemiah, and he'd give the rest to the king, and he'd keep a little for himself. And like all the layers of government need to get their share. And you think about what we just read of how poor these people are. They can't even put food on their table. They say, we have too many mouths to feed. And so Nehemiah looks at that and said, cut me out and cut my servants out of that chain, and let's try to lighten the burden on these people because I know they're suffering. I know they're hurting. And I think it's interesting that he says he does this because of the fear of God. And at the end, like Ryan pointed out, he says, I'm doing this, remember, for my good, oh my God, all that I've done for the people. He still had a lot of expenses and a lot of things that he had to do. He is the governor, so he is the representative of the Persian king. It's not going to be a little small table with a couple of things on it, and he still lays that out. There's 150 people, we're killing this many animals, we're having this much wine, we're doing all of these things, but I kind of wonder how he did pay for it. What we know is that he didn't tax the people, he didn't charge the people, and in that way it's a great foil to what we were talking about before, that our job is to be generous, to be compassionate, to do everything in our power to try to be helping our fellow brother and not putting an extra burden on them. One of the other themes that I think we see in this chapter is, what do we do when we have a little bit of power? So think about how the Jewish nobles and officials handled their little bit of power and how oppressive they were and how they were forcing people into slavery, and apparently nobody called them on it for a while until it was brought before Nehemiah. And then you see Nehemiah, who had great authority. He was the Persian governor. He was the one calling the shots in the province, and he thought, let me use this for the benefit of others. And so I think we can all look at our lives, and we may not be the preeminent ruler and authority, but we have a lot. And we have a lot of stuff, and we have a lot of opportunity, and we have a lot of ability. And how are we using that? Are we using that to serve ourselves, or are we using that to be generous and to be looking out for each other? I'll close with the words of Jesus in Mark chapter 10, where he said, you know that those who are considered rulers over the Gentiles lord it over them, but it shall not be so among you. Whoever would be great among you must be your servant. And that's one of the ways I think Nehemiah is a precursor of Christ. He's leading, but he's leading for the people. He's looking out for the little ones. He's bringing fairness and justice and making sure that everyone is well taken care of. Just for next time, read Nehemiah chapter 6 and be thinking about what gets thrown at Nehemiah here and what are the lessons that we can learn from it. Pretty similar to how we've been going through the other chapters. Thank you guys for your comments and discussion.